The square was once, early centuries, 17th, 18th, 19th century, were big flashy houses belonging to the aristocrats who owned most of England. Actually, some of them still do. But there's been it's now completely commercial. The last private house was sold in 1953, I think. It's still the most quintessentially English place in London in some ways. But don't be fooled. A private investor from one of the Arab countries, from one of the oil countries, I think, bought 100 properties in and around the square for £300 million in 2001, including probably the Jack Berkeley and the Bentley showrooms you saw earlier. He paid 300 million quid. It's probably worth about £1 billion now. Very good buy, and probably actually a bit more probably. Don't believe anything that Boris Johnson writes on the side of the bus. If he says that when Brexit finally grinds to a halt, we get it back, we don't. He still keeps it. So I'm not sure what we are getting back, not an awful lot in some ways. The aristocrats, as I say, the resident aristocrats went a long time ago, but in 1962, they came back, some of them, their descendants came back to gamble in John Aspinall's Clermont casino, which you couldn't see earlier and still can't, I think. I never worked there, but a friend of mine did, right from day one, and was there for an awful long time. And the stories he told me about the conversations on the card tables, on chemin de fer, a French game mostly, when the cards were being shuffled by what was known as the Aspinall set, which included the previously mentioned Lord Lucan, the man who didn't mistake his wife for a hat stand, but mistook his children's nanny for his wife, with famously fatal consequences. The conversations, though, that took place during the shuffling of the cards, in between what we call the shoes, horrified me as a lifelong Labour voter. The general tone was that there were far too many people in the world, and at least 3/4 of them should be done away with as soon as possible. Not, of course, including any of present company or anybody really who had any money, but all the riffraff were just breeding like flies and should be done away with. Now, John Aspinall actually was a very dedicated, very skilled breeder of various apes and big cats, tigers and snow tigers, all that kind of stuff, at his 2 estates in Kent. And they weren't there for the entertainment of the public. They were to send back to when there wasn't a war on or whatever, they were to be sent back to live in the wilds where they belonged. That's the admirable side of John Aspinall I mentioned earlier. That was his reason for wanting to get rid of 3/4 of the world's population. The others wanted to get rid of 3/4 of the world's population because they basically didn't like poor people, especially if their skins weren't white. So the aristocrats come and go in Berkeley Square, but that was the main the main drag. They lived there in 17th, 18th, 19th century, and they came to gamble and talk real hard politics, very far right politics, from 1962 onwards. Whenever there was a Labour government, which there were in the 1960s, old-fashioned Labour governments, they used to talk about the night that we need a night of the long knives, kill all these communist bastards, and get proper conservatives back in control. Well, they never did start a revolution. They're too busy playing cards. But that's the kind of political background to the early days at the Clermont. Later, like everywhere else, it's concentrated on Arab players and Far Eastern players who had even more money than Britain's aristocrats, and I don't think ever had a losing year. The most famous thing about it was that the host was a even then slightly aging American actor called George Raft, who was in lots of crime films, a lot of them quite forgettable, but one very good one called Some Like It Hot, which you may have seen. It's a kind of black comedy. He played the unlucky spats who got shot to bits at a big crime dinner one evening. George Raft reappears when we look at another casino only a few hundred yards away. Chesterfield Gardens, which isn't actually in Curzon Street, but it's just a very short cul-de-sac off Curzon Street, there was the 21 Club. It belonged to what you might call a nice gangster. I don't think he ever killed anybody or did anything very violent. He was more commercial. Called Harry Meadows. And of course, if you, in those days, in the early 60s, if you were a reasonably well-known gangster and you didn't own a casino, it was social death. I mean, you were just a punk. Anyway, it worked very well. It ran very well. But it's most famous now for one of the worst films ever made, being that the casino scenes are taking place in Harry Meadows 21. It was the only James Bond film which wasn't bought by the people who made all the other James Bond films. It was Casino Royale, not to be confused with the recent Casino Royale, which is obviously more like the book. It was a spoof. It's a fantastic cast with David Niven, George Raft was in it, Orson Welles, Peter Sellers, and loads more, and including a very pretty girl whose sort of film name was Miss Goodthighs, which you can draw your own conclusions from that. If the film it was a commercial hit. It cost something like $10 million, which is a lot of money. It was made in 67, I think. It was a lot of money then for a film. And in the end, it took about 40 million, so it was a commercial success, but was just a complete turkey. It was panned by every critic. I went to see it once because a friend of mine worked as an extra, as a croupier on it. I used to go along and sort of watch him, and he, the film went down like a lead balloon critically, but as I say, it made money. I went to see it in the cinema, and about a third of the way through, I got up and went to a nearby pub because it just wasn't funny enough. You know, it really was rubbish, and that's the main claim to fame of a 21 Club. It didn't survive the 1968 clean-up, when all the bad guys were sent packing allegedly. Harry went. I don't know what he did after that, but it wasn't casinos. Well, not in England anyway.